Close your eyes if you like. Not because I ask it, but because the dark is a soft thing and the stars are patient listeners. Breathe with me once, slowly, in and out. Let your shoulders drop. Let the mind unburden itself of the day's small, sharp noises. There is a story to come. But first there is the hush. A vast, slow hush that stretches between the lights of 1,000 worlds. Imagine the galaxy as if it were a great old sea. From here on the deck of a sleeper ship or beneath the transparent dome of some quiet observatory, you watch it move. Stars are lanterns on that sea, some faint as candle embers, some bright as molten coins. They drift in patterns older than language, long, slow arcs of light, pairs of flaring twins, lonely beacons clinging to the edge of darkness. The spaces between them are velvet and cool, the kind of cool that presses gently against your skin and makes you aware of being alive. In this wide, patient dark, there are worlds. Think of them as islands, blue with oceans, grey with stones, black with forests, that whisper in winds you cannot hear from here. Each world holds its own small history. The echo of a child's laughter in a courtyard, the scrape of a farmer's boot along an old metal gate, the lullaby hummed in a bunk on a ship whose name is almost forgotten. Multiply those moments by the thousands and the millions. The result is a human chorus that folds into the night like something warm and living. Long before these voices were many, there was one figure who moved through the oldest histories like a half-remembered dream. The man, the legend, the presence that would come to be called the Emperor. In stories told in the hush of children's rooms, he appears as a distant lighthouse, benevolent, patient, the architect of reunions. He is described in tones both reverent and tender, as one who would gather scattered kin and stitch their edges together. When you picture him, imagine a silhouette against the dawn, wide-shouldered and still, hands held open as if to receive small stars falling into his palms. Those early images are soft. They are the sort of images you would place in the center of a bedtime tale, a father searching for his children among sleeping continents and quiet suns. He walks worlds whose names we no longer speak aloud. He passes over ruined altars and gardens still brave enough to bloom. He carries promise like a small, bright thing wrapped in cloth and tucked into the breast of his coat. His voice, in these gentle versions, is measured and warm, and when he speaks, people say their labors seem less heavy. And yet, listen closely, not with fear but with careful attention. The tone of that legend does not stay wholly warm. There is an underside to the light. Legends, after all, are often built from necessity, what must be believed to keep cold things at bay. The Emperor, for all his stated tenderness, is also the shaping hand. His love in the stories grows into a plan. The plan grows into an order. The order becomes something precise and unyielding. Where love softens and folds, purpose presses and carves. Imagine, if you can, someone who gathers stray lanterns not only to warm them, but to place them into a pattern that will never change. There is comfort there, certainly, but comfort that asks for obedience in return. Across the sea of stars, human colonies lay scattered like driftwood, small settlements clinging to rocky moons, vast colonies of chrome and glass-ringing sleeping suns, dark habitats that float and turn in the slow ballet of space. On each one, people wake and sleep in cycles lit by distant constellations. They hitch their lives to ships and to the rhythm of work. They tell one another stories, and sometimes those stories contain a map that shows how the pockets of humanity might once again be stitched into a single cloth. These colonies wait, not always in hope, but often in a settled kind of expectation. For generations they have watched the sky, and in the quiet hours some have even believed, for comfort's sake, in the footsteps of a single walker traversing the dark. Yet the distance between them is not simply measured in light years. Between every inhabited world and the next, there lies another kind of distance. A stormed river, known to few except those who study the old sciences and the old prayers. This river is the warp, a place of currents and eddies that moves like a breath across the intervening dark. From afar, the warp seems like a shimmering mirage of colors too bright to be honest. Up close, it is a place of voices, of pressure, of things that echo thoughts back at you in altered form. Do not think of the warp as a boogeyman. It is a vast and brilliant ocean of feeling, an untamed mirror where the inner life of sentience spills into something other. It is the place where dreams leak and mingle, where hope can become a beacon, and fear can catch fire. Sailors who cross it for a living speak of it with a mixture of professional calm and a tired understatement, as men and women do of storms at sea. And like an ocean, it has weather. Storms in the warp are not just winds and rain. They are nights when the sky itself seems to whisper. The whisper is important. It is never merely sound. It is the kind of whisper that curves around the edges of your own thoughts and leaves a small, curious mark, as if someone else has read the beginning of your sentence and smiled. Into those waters, into the arms of that great strange ocean, were cast a set of children. Not children in the sense of small bodies and high shoes, but children in the image of potential and the weight of futures. They were the Primarchs, and at first the word may mean little to you beyond its cadence. Primarch. It sounds like a lullaby. Imagine it as the name given to a constellation of potential. Vast minds, enormous bodies, the kinds of beings whose decisions alter the spine of history. In the gentler versions of the tale, they are imagined as lost sons and daughters. Brilliant scouts sent to the dark to bring light into the places where humanity had been scattered. But they were scattered like seeds, torn from the soil and flung by a tempest. Some landed on hospitable ground and took root in the most unexpected places. A ruined orchard beneath orange skies, a volcanic spit of stone that still held warm air beneath a thin crust of ash, a hive of towers so close together that sunlight touched only their upper edges. Others were placed where the ground was harsh and the air tasted of iron. There, they cut their teeth on hardship and learned the languages of survival. Their childhoods, if childhood is even the right word, were raw and squeezed into narrow shapes by whatever world had claimed them. The Emperor, in those gentle stories, does not then simply pick them up and lead them home. The search is patient. He sends out the long, slow tendrils of fleets and banners, messages carried on flames of diplomacy as much as on guns. These arms, the ships, the envoys, the heralds, are like lullabies passed from one sleeping world to another, small signs that someone remembers you. For people in small settlements, the arrival of a single messenger can feel like the promise of a parent returning after a long voyage. Imagine a child looking up at a star and knowing, in the small way children do, that someone watches. And yet, woven through these caregiving gestures, there is a formal structure that does not touch the softness of home. Promises take the shape of manifestos. Manifestos become march plans. Where someone might reach for a hand, a design reaches for a hold. People are not simply gathered, they become parts within a larger mechanism. The metaphor is simple, a loom and its threads. You feel the calm when you imagine being gathered by such a hand, warmth, belonging, but you also feel the small, cold edge of inevitability. Threads are not free, they are guided. This is no judgment, merely a small factual observation. Now, listen for the sounds that live just under these images. There is the distant hum of great engines, not thunderous, not urgent, more like a steady heartbeat that has beaten through centuries. It is the hum of vessels in transit, of slips of metal sliding home, of ancient gaskets and slow bearings turning with the patience of old clocks. There are the softer sounds too, the whisper of gears behind chapel doors, the rustle of robes where tech priests move with liturgical precision, the rustling static of vox transmissions that pass from world to world. These noises are like threads in a soundscape that is at once mechanical and intimate. Like a lullaby played on iron strings, they are reassuring in their constancy. And they are unsettling in their implication that the world is held together by mechanisms that know their own rhythms better than any human heart might. Imagine, for a moment, sitting by a window in a small ecumenical chapel on a world that has not seen visitors in 100 years. Outside the glass, there is a silver rain that patters on domes and on the phosphorescent leaves of alien trees. Inside, a tech priest moves through the aisle with measured steps. His robes whisper on deck plating. His fingers are ringed with brass and wire. Part of him is warm muscle and warm blood, and part of him is calibrated metal. He speaks into the air as if addressing an old machine. The voice is low and ritualized, like prayer and protocol braided together. To eyes trained on domestic life, such a figure is both comforting and faintly uncanny. Comforting because he is a caretaker of the machines that make their lives possible. Uncanny because, in his attention to the machine, he seems to listen sometimes to a different sound entirely. So the galaxy yawns and breathes, full of need and full of the impulse to mend that need with design. The Emperor stands in the center of many such images. A beacon, a craftsman, a ruler. He is gentle in the way a glacier is gentle, inevitable, slow, capable of shaping the world with a force no single life can resist. The Primarchs are the instruments by which the shaping begins. They are not in truth mere instruments. They are minds with dreams, bodies with scars, virtues and faults in equal measure. But for now they are shadows on the edge of the story, figures whose names are murmured like prayers in barracks and like lullabies in kitchens. It is here, in this soft and watchful beginning, that the first faint signs of unease appear. Not sudden, not violent, only a small thing. A whisper that repeats not once but twice. A captain in a distant cruiser pauses mid-meal as the ship's vox bends the edges of his thoughts into a phrase he has not spoken aloud. A child in a farming valley dreams of a shadow taller than the sun. A bell in a forgotten monastery rings when no one is near it, and the tone is slightly colder than before, like metal cooled by deep water. These are the subtle notes that tell you a different tempo is possible. The warp, with its bright and deadly weather, will be the place where those notes sometimes become a motif. For now, they are only hints. A painting mostly done, with a single corner still wet. At the edges of the dream of reunification, there gathers a dark patience, an intelligence that waits and watches. It is not malevolent like a predator. It is older in the way tides are old, inevitable in the way change is inevitable, and uncannily interested in the particulars of human longing. That interest, unnoticed, tends to amplify what you already feel. Hope becomes a flare. Fear becomes a signal. Small things echo and become larger. So lie still and keep breathing that slow, even breath. Let the image of stars settle like a warm cloak around your shoulders. Picture the Emperor as both comfort and calculus, a benevolent hand that also shapes. Picture the scattered colonies waiting like small, patient lamps. Picture the Primarchs as vast seeds in strange soils, as lost children whose names first appear in whispers and then in prayers. Hold these images without clutching them. Watch them move across the night. And if a whisper reaches you now, a soft, folded sound that feels like memory and like wind, do not startle. Let it pass through the room like cool air. In the stillness between heartbeats, in the quiet between stars, there is room for both the tender and the terrible. For now, the terrible is only an undernote, a promise of intensity yet to come. Sleep will come in its own time, and with it, the next part of the journey. The slow, certain march from lullaby to omen, from light to the first thin, insistent shadow. Rest, then. The story will continue when you are ready. For the moment, the galaxy sleeps, but it is not quiet in the way of innocence. It is patient, watchful, and full of things that listen. Picture first a figure who arrives like a wolf's shadow beneath a moon. He is the stillness before a winter hunt, a presence that makes the air go quieter rather than louder. In grand accounts, he is called a strategist and a reclusive lord, a leader who reads maps the way others read scripture. There is warmth in the idea of a commander who thinks for his men, who chooses the slow and steady road so fewer lives break upon it. Imagine the faint squeak of leather as he shifts in an ancient chair, the soft click of servos in his helm when he allows himself to be alone. But listen longer, and you feel how that silence can become a ward. The lion's calm is not the gentle hush of sleep. It is the pressure of an animal that has learned to hold back its speed, an energy kept taut by purpose. Where his men find shelter in his planning, there is also the slight cold of a ruler who prefers to keep faces turned to the map rather than to the hearth. The Emperor's hand that raised him is tidy here, design wrapped in the guise of stewardship. The price of that order is a narrowing of compassion, a habit of seeing people as pieces on a board rather than stories in a cradle. Now see a blade of light, graceful, polished, and dazzling. Fulgrim moves as if the world were an instrument tuned to his satisfaction. His laughter is silver. The hum of his armor is a delicate note. The myth of him is of beauty perfected, of art made martial, of a prince who teaches soldiers how to hold themselves like sculptures. Think of the smell of oil and rosewater, the faint clink of jewelry exchanged, as if it were ceremony. Beneath the sheen, however, there is a susceptibility to obsession. Beauty that started as kindness curdles into vanity. Refinement becomes a hunger for approval that will not be sated by trophies or praise. Where once his hands were tools of craft, they begin to demand their own reflection. The Emperor's plan that crafted such elegance did so with a precise hand. An instrument meant to inspire, yes, but one also dangerously in love with its own tune. That love can soften a person into ruin as readily as it can raise them to marvel. And when the song turns sour, the brightest blade reflects the darkest things most clearly. Imagine cold iron set into a quiet mind. Perturabo is the architect of fortresses, the engineer whose diagrams knit walls into promises of safety. He gives people shelter they did not know they needed. They thank him in the short days between sieges. Hear the measured clank of gauntlets and the patient groan of cranes in his presence. There is a certain comfort in his exactness. A world ordered like a machine, every bolt accounted for. Yet that machine has teeth. Architecture that begins as protection can calcify into siegecraft that never releases its hold. Perturabo's love is for the permanence of his constructs, and permanence, when wrenched from the living, becomes an insistence that everything conform. The Emperor carved precision into him as if it were a virtue, but gave him little warmth to temper it. The result is a man who trusts steel before speech, who sees people as materials to be shaped rather than companions to be read. In private, perhaps, he listens to the echo in a finished wall and finds the sound of his own loneliness answering back. Picture wind, like silk, swift, unpredictable, with laughter at its edges. Jagatai Khan is the rider poet, the desert sun who treats the horizon as both challenge and partner. His presence feels like the rustle of banners, the feel of sand under boot and hoof. His fighters are taught to move like the wind, never to stay in one place where the blunt weight of war can crush them. There is something freeing about him, a noble joy in motion, a desire to see all the world's edges. Subtly, though, that desire becomes restlessness. The Khan's love of movement resists anchoring to people or long, slow tenderness. The Emperor's design gives him freedom as a weapon, which gifts him speed and insight, but also seeds a skepticism toward permanence. Where others build legacies, he prefers to keep riding, to let names drift like dust. The cost of that is sometimes the small betrayals of absence. A father who rides past a child sleeping in the straw, thinking the next dawn can always be borrowed. Think of a drumbeat in a northern hall, of laughter, of someone who can lift an apple with the same hand that lifts a hammer. Leman Russ is a primal force. Comrades call him a brother who drinks with them beneath bonfires and sharpens axes at dawn. There is warmth in his thunderous voice, a simple kind of truth that comforts those who seek plain edges and honest fights. The hum of his armor is a low, rolling growl. In moments of privacy, the sound is almost like thunder under a blanket. Yet thunder can crack and leave a smoking fissure in its wake. Russ's passion for ferocity and honor can close like a jaw on doubts and questions. The Emperor shaped in him the virtues of loyalty and courage, but gave him a taste for the direct that can fail in subtler times. His love of the hunt and the brawl shades into a hunger that mistakes intensity for meaning, and sometimes the simplest solution a hammer mind offers is to strike when conversation might have been enough. Picture a bastion, unmovable, precise, chastened by service. Rogel Dawn is the man of ramparts, patient and immovable, whose trust is in stone and in the discipline that tempers panic into defense. He moves in careful steps, his armor's low hum like a metronome. In the quiet of a watchtower, he hears the world's minor pains and translates them into plans to protect. But the same steadiness can harden into an inflexible moral architecture. Dawn's sense of duty, a virtue in frost, becomes, under the Emperor's hand, a creed less tolerant of nuance. Men under his care find safety, and also the weight of being constantly assessed by hardened standards. In rooms where others would reach out for compassion, Dawn reaches instead for orders and systems. His affection is often practical, wrapped in schedules and manifestos, which comforts the liable but chills the needy. Imagine twilight stretched into a single, ever-lengthening moment. Konrad Kurz is the shadow that studies the sorrow of civilization and decides the cost of correcting it. There is melancholy in his gait, a poet's understanding of violence as a mirror of a broken society. The quiet of his armor is like the soft fall of night on a city. In private, his voice might be a murmur that reads crimes aloud as if reciting psalms. Yet that melancholy deepens into a peculiar cruelty. Kurz sees crime and seeks to excise it with a knife sharpened by certainty. The Emperor's design placed a sense of grim judgment in him, and that judgment sometimes sees only the act and not the man. In his watch, the night is a mantle he cannot put off. He becomes the dark that punishes. The tenderness he might have had branches into a terrible logic, that to remove pain someone must inflict it. and thus a savior becomes indistinguishable from the terror he would quell. Now a soft, almost angelic light. Sanguinius is the figure of open grace, a smile that stops quarrels, a presence like warm air after an unkind winter. The hum of his armor has the timbre of a choir. Where he goes, people feel lighter. Armies march with a strange, brave levity. In private, he may unbraid his hair and listen to the quiet of his own breath, like someone who savors being alive. And yet, within that radiance, there is a keen edge. Beauty wired into duty can become martyrdom. The Emperor's plan put a tenderness into Sanguinius that is as dangerous as it is divine, because it causes him to carry the suffering of others as willingly as a mantle. Love without reservation can be a blade. It cuts the bearer as well as the world. Sanguinius's generosity of spirit becomes a vulnerability, an opening where compassion can be exploited by colder designs. Imagine the smell of fresh metal, the taste of cool forge water, and hands that know every seam of a machine. Ferrus Manus is the smith made human, his mind aligned to the geometry of gears and the quiet music made by moving parts. He is reliable as a well-made clock, warm in the blunt way of someone whose work is honest labor. The hum of his implants is the sound of a workshop at dawn. Still, an intimacy with the uncompromising logic of machinery hardens feeling. The Emperor shaped in him an admiration for function and craft. Ferrus loves things that do what they are meant to do. People, being less predictable, sometimes fail that test. The result is a man who finds more faith in steel than in the frailties of mortal expression. When machines betray or falter, the disappointment is not abstract. It is personal, a wound that sometimes becomes resentment directed at the messy world of blood and heart. Think of a battlefield that never sleeps, a drum of pain tapped until it becomes music. Angron is the raw coil of rage, the soldier who was forged on an altar of violence and never given the chance to unlearn its cadence. There is a harshness to his hum, a serrated sound like chains sliding. He is the brother who will take a blow so that none else need, and who will then strike like a gale. But rage, left to its own devices, is a corrosive companion. The Emperor's hand that raised Angron made of him a weapon with little room for tenderness. His living taught him to endure by becoming hard, and the hardness eats the soft centers. Companionship becomes possession, and anger becomes a language he prefers to the vocabulary of care. His private moments are haunted by the echo of the fists that made him and the hands that restrained him. Those echoes sometimes answer back with fresh fury. Picture fog that comes in slow and cold, settling into the bones until movement becomes a decision with a cost. Mortarion is the captain of quiet doom. He moves with an internal chill that makes even warm rooms feel colder. His armor's low, distant hum sounds like wind along empty moors. He brings absolutes, a grim clarity that tries to clean rot with surgical force. Yet absolutes do not always account for mercy. Mortarion's distance is not pure indifference. It is the residue of a childhood of inhaled poisons and hard lessons. The Emperor shaped him to be relentless against rot and pestilence. But relentlessness, when it becomes a worldview, sometimes kills the impulse to repair rather than replace. In private, he might hold a small thing, a relic, a memory, and feel its warmth as a foreign, unwieldy weight. That something he cannot save becomes a grief turned inward, which can seed a contempt for what he does not understand. Now picture libraries stacked until the ceilings are lost in shadow, the scent of ink and ozone, and a mind that hums like 1,000 data streams. Magnus is the scholar magus, whose appetite for knowledge is both a bright gift and a slow-burning hunger. You hear in his presence the soft clicking of arcane instruments, the rustle of pages, the muttered equations that sound like prayers. There is wonder in him, a curiosity that feels like sunshine poured into rooms formerly locked. But hunger for sight can become blindness of a different kind. Magnus's need to know every seam of reality can estrange him from the simple acts of being with others. The Emperor's plan gave him vast faculties for thought, and a license to probe where others fear to look. And when a man sees too clearly, the things he sees can change how he loves. Knowledge can seduce into certainty, and then into a kind of isolation. The scholar who sacrifices contact for comprehension, who listens to equations instead of laughter, and who sometimes forgets that not every truth must be held as a weapon. Imagine a warmth that gathers people like moths to a lamp, charismatic, immediate, the sort of presence that makes crowds hush and soldiers stand taller of their own accord. Horus is the first among equals in storybook tones, the leader whose courage feels like an invitation to be brave. Listen for the loyal chorus of boots in his shadow, and the low thrumming of armor like a steady drum. Yet central light casts deep shadows. Horus's gift for uniting men into a single purpose is also a fulcrum on which many expectations balance. The Emperor's design elevated him as a hand extended to the rest. That extension, though meant to hold, can buckle under the strain of being everything to everyone. The burden of being loved and trusted so readily can twist into an ache that looks outward for comfort. A man who feels everyone's need can start to believe his judgment must answer for them, and that belief can become a river that erodes the banks of humility. Think of a voice raised in him beneath gilded vaults. Lorgar is faith made articulate. He moves as if every stone is a scripture, every low murmur a line in a ceremony. His armor's hum carries the cadence of chanting. In small rooms he might sit with icons, arranging them like a gardener prunes roses. There is a sanctity to him, a deep hunger to craft meaning where none seems obvious. But meaning can calcify into dogma. The Emperor's hand instilled in Lorgar a desire for reverence, a need to shape people's hearts, and that need sometimes refuses the messy, questioning reality of human doubt. Where some seek to hold a person gently and help them find faith, Lorgar sometimes seeks to fix that faith into an architecture of belief that leaves little room for private sorrow or quiet dissent. His rituals comfort and command. They bind, picture fires that serve the hearth and not the forge, warmth that returns to those who give it. Vulcan is the maker who remembers to warm hands as he works, a Primarch whose myth is of forges lit for the people, whose laughter is a bell that rings in kitchens and workshops alike. There is a deep, steady hum to his presence, the kind that comforts like a well-built stove in midwinter. But a maker's hands are also hands that can shape fate, and fate sometimes needs to be pried open with force. The Emperor gave Vulcan endurance and compassion in one package, which can be a dangerous combination. One who will rebuild the world, but has little tolerance for those who will not lift a finger to help themselves. That impatience can fracture tenderness into exasperation that hurts the very ones he loves most. In private, his fingers may ache with the weight of tasks that cannot be undone, and that ache sometimes shows as a hardness behind softness. Imagine dusk over a sleeping marsh, the hush of wings, and the stealth of a hand that moves to relieve shackles quietly. Corax is the liberator in narrative, a man of silent justice who seeks to undo chains and to bring light to places where order has settled into oppression. His armor hums like an owl's wing, soft and precise. He moves in shadows not to hide himself, but to free others with minimal blood. Yet secrecy can grow into isolation. Corax's methods require distance, and distance can become a wall that hides pain and doubt. The Emperor's shaping of him emphasized liberty and stealth, but liberty is hard to enforce without sometimes becoming judgmental of those who are still learning to walk. A man who frees others can forget to ask for help too. In private, the quiet that once felt sacred can become a loneliness whose echo tastes of ash. Picture order so perfect it reads like a garden, each hedge trimmed to the same careful angle. Robout Guilliman is administration incarnate, the planner whose hand writes laws and who believes systems can save more lives than heroics. The hum of his warplate has the cadence of a registry being rung. In private, he attends to ledgers and manifests like prayers made practical. And yet the faith in systems can eclipse the need for mercy. Guilliman's love is for structures that outlive individuals. His care is measured in policies and outcomes. The Emperor's design placed in him a love of civilization that could border on the bureaucratic, efficiency that may miss the human curve in favor of streamlined verdicts. In rooms where a father might sit and speak to a son, Guilliman sometimes sets up a table and a timetable. People take comfort in being understood by rules and are sometimes strangled by them. Imagine at once a trick of mirrors and a twin flame, two faces that answer to the same name, two wills that mirror and confuse. Alpharius and Omegan are the puzzle wrapped in an enigma. The trickster siblings who teach that identity can be a tool. Their armor hums in counterpoint, the sound of a riddle retold. They appear like a tale told twice, and then told differently. Their gift is cunning. Their danger is deceit. The Emperor's sculpting of a dual mind was intentional. Two hands to play a single game of guile. But guile, when it becomes habit, can hollow the truth from the heart. Where others speak plainly, these two manage masks. That ability is brilliant in strategy and lonely in intimacy. In private, their mirrored faces might study one another and find the same unanswerable question: who are we beneath our craft? Finally, there are curtains drawn across two empty alcoves. In Hymn and Hush, people sometimes speak of them as the ones the stars forgot to name, or as leaves torn from the first pages of a book. There are few words that can be safely used about them. What remains instead are impressions, the sense of gaps in careful plans, a silence where a voice may once have been meant. Imagine the quiet fold of a curtain, the soft, abrupt hush that follows the abrupt end of a theatre's music. Those absences themselves become a kind of presence. The Emperor's design, immaculate as it may be elsewhere, has corners that shadow. The forgotten too become mirror silences, reminders that even the grandest workshops can misplace a tool, and that loss can shape the tale as surely as presence can. In the hush of memory, they seem almost to watch, not with eyes, for they have none to our knowledge, but with the cool attention of missing things that give impetus to those who remain. Each Primarch, now pictured beside you, like a candle, holds both the candlelight's comfort and the wax that melts. Some burn steady and bright, others flare and crack. Their greatness sings softly at first, a lullaby made of courage, craft, and love. The hum of armor is a kind of music, even in their private moments, when helmets are removed, when the great voices of command fall away. There lies the echo of a child's first small memory. Feel that echo, in the quiet after the name is spoken, something like a backyard game, a wound from an early winter, a laugh stolen in a narrow alley. These are the kernels of humanity tucked inside iron ribs. The Emperor's hand placed each kernel with intent. Greatness assembled like a machine of living parts. Yet intent is not tenderness. A plan is not the same as a prayer. The more the designs unfurled into the wide galaxy, the more the human pieces inside those designs began to announce themselves as stubborn little things that would not be, shaped without leaving scratches. And so the warm descriptions we tell at bedside of champions and fathers and artisans carry with them, if we pay attention, the thin thread of unease. Each Primarch wears a uniqueness that makes them beloved and dangerous. They are mythic not only because they are large and powerful, but because they hold inside them the same contradictions every small life does. Kindness that can harden into cruelty, love that can burn into obsession, discipline that can calcify into indifference. Let the soundscape return to you now, the faint hum of armor, the whisper of cloaks, the tiny domestic noises that remind you these massive forms were once, in their smallest moments, as fragile as any child. Imagine for a breath the echo of a childhood lullaby carried into a hall of war, and the way that lullaby might sound differently when a sentinel stands over it, or when a mind trained on gears hears it as a metered rhythm to be improved. You have been shown the faces. Keep them loose in your mind, not pinned as trophies, but remembered like names called across a field. There and then gone, the Emperor's cold design shaped them into stars, and every star, even the coldest, throws a shadow. In that shadow lie the hints of what will come. The slow unthreading, the whisper at the warp's edge, the sense that not everything bright is benign. For now, let that thought be small and distant, like the ticking of a clock you can almost not hear. Rest with the idea that greatness is a strange thing to tuck into bed, comforting for its promise, unsettling for the weight it brings. Soon we will bend the light to see how those shadows lengthen. The fleets moved like a slow, obedient migration, not a stampede nor a careless scatter, but a measured procession that filled the vacuum with careful purpose. In the beginning, their passage was a comfort. Imagine them from a distance. Long spines of metal and light, banners folded against hulls like sleeping flags, the pale tracer fire of their engines cutting steady lanes through the dark. In the hush of the void, they sounded almost musical. Deep thrums from reactors, a distant chiming as gravity drives engaged and disengaged, the soft backwash of a wake that was not water but light years of intent. At first, the narration of the Crusade is told in gentle cadences, exploration, discovery, reunification. There is a beauty to that telling. Emissaries break atmosphere over worlds who have not seen a ship in generations. Children in makeshift villages look up and point. Elders cross themselves. Markets close mid-song so the whole settlement might watch. There are scenes like warm vignettes. A farmer stumbles from a shack, dust clinging to hair and beard, and bends to touch the hull of a friendly courier, as if it were the cheek of an old friend. Priests take off their gloves and light candles in chapels that smell of resin and sea salt. For a time, the story feels like a long, slow homecoming. Explore a world where the first landing is quiet and tender. The harbingers come in small craft that drop like birds onto plazas, hung with banners of different ages. Their crews step down with careful politeness, and translators sing the same words across dialects. You are not forgotten. On another world, a child who has never seen a starship draws the shape of a hull in the dust and keeps it like a pet, smoothing its lines with a small, reverent hand. Reunification, at this phase, reads like a succession of small miracles. Systems rebooted, wells cleaned, medicines distributed, lost messages finally answered, songs pass from one colony to another, and for a while, the galaxy seems less like a scattering and more like a knitting being gently pulled together at the edges. The Primarchs are the centerpieces of many of these scenes, and the early stories of their visits are told with an affectionate awe. Where a herald might bring a common fleet, a Primarch's arrival rewrites the sky. Imagine the sound of a warship falling into atmosphere, like a mountain sliding into the sea. Imagine the whistle of stabilizers and the roar of a landing that throws dust and light into an instant of absolute attention. People fall to their knees because they do not know which is more fearsome: the way the world tilts under the weight of their presence, or the tenderness that sometimes follows. A Primarch in those first days will kneel, or will put a hand upon a child's head, or will lift a small thing, a toy, a trinket, and show it to his legion as if to say quietly, "For this, we fight." The Crusade's outward shapes are reassuring. Battles are precise. Planetary governors are persuaded to accept the Pax, and in exchange they are given the means to rebuild cities long eroded by time. There are fleets of engineers and priests, caravans of surgeons and teachers who follow the banners. Gravelled streets are swept, children taught to read, songs altered only slightly so new verses can be added commemorating the day the banners arrived. Those very practical acts are narrated with a calming rhythm: repair, instruction, distribution. The galaxy breathes out relief, yet as with any long breathing, the exhale reveals the deeper rhythm of the lungs. The first thin shiver of unease arrives like the scent at the edge of a memory. It is not loud. A captain receives a sealed transmission whose ink is not ink, but a corrosion, and the paper curls where his fingers have read it, as if memory had physically retracted. A survey team on an unassuming world finds a necropolis where the bones of a species they had imagined as alien and unknowable lie arranged, like trophies in a tableau, not shattered in battle, but placed in positions that intimate private habits. A family dining, a scholar bent to a desk, a child asleep. There is an intimacy to the arrangement that makes the hair on a man's arm stand up. How close the dead had been to the shape of life, and how carefully someone had posed them into it. Again, the voice of the Crusade tries to soothe. Perhaps some calamity froze those people mid-gesture. Perhaps an invasive fungus or solar flare took them in an instant. Stories like these are pleasant for a while because they permit the mind to place them in boxes labelled curiosity and study. Teams of archaeologists put their gloves on, trace the grooves a hand made on an armchair, and find notes in a strange script that begin like a love letter and end like a prayer. There is poetry in the silent rooms, and for a time the primary sensation is heartbreak. Those lives halted in the midst of private routines. But heartbreak breeds another sound, the faint echo of something else that does not fit the tidy explanation of accident. In the long, hush-lit corridors of newly reopened structures, there is a metallic whisper that does not belong to the stillness of abandoned places. It could be nothing but the settling of ancient tubes. It could be small animals. But in the mouths of the men and women who spend their nights within those halls, the sound learns to talk. An engineer wakes up in the early chill and says he dreamt the skeletons turned their heads and listened. A priest returns, pallid and staring, with a scrap of fabric clamped in fingers that felt as though they had been rearranged into someone else's script. There are more tangible dangers too. The Crusade expands across worlds that are not empty at all. On a frontier world, a vanguard discovers a blackened plain and picks through the remains of a defensive stand. Not human, but not wholly alien either. Something with too many limbs and too many eyes, and the anatomy of a dream. The corpses are neither softened by decay, nor preserved by cold. Instead, their flesh has been calcified into scales, and their eyes still gleam with a wetness that suggests an unspent horror. The soldiers stand there, not in triumph, but in the odd hush of witnesses. They catalogue the bones, note the predatory adaptations, and mutter hypotheses to justify the encounter. The normalcy of cataloguing is a thin veneer over the clench in the throat that comes from seeing something so thoroughly ended and so suspiciously placed. More unsettling are the signs that these dead were not merely passive victims. In the mouth of a long dead beast, a small metallic device grated faintly when touched. In ruins, reliefs show humanoid hands, wearing ornate rings, laying talismans on dead brow. The thing posed like a domestic tableau now reads like ritual, where in earlier decades archaeologists might have thought in terms of biology and geology. Now they begin to speak in terms of ritual and deliberate slaughter. If the dead were killed in a religious rite, for what purpose was that rite performed? Who ordered the world to silence itself as a tableau? And why was it done with such care that watchers might later find it beautiful and terrible at once? In the quieter days of the Crusade, when ships used their light to stitch the darkness together like needles through cloth, the Primarchs began to show the creases in their great banners. Their methods, once a source of comfort, began to tighten like a hand around a wrist. At first, it is almost invisible. A patrol that fails to return is replaced by a detachment that takes greater liberties with local laws. Colonial governors, who balk at edicts, find their officers reassigned or their privileges quietly restructured. The language shifts as well. Reunification becomes consolidation. Offer becomes mandate. The Primarch's zeal is a slow slope. A Primarch will first deliver a speech that comforts, about unity, about the dignity of being under a larger canopy. He will speak of duty as a shared warmth, of sacrifice as a gentle tool. People will listen and feel safe. Then, in a later address, some phrase will flicker in a new place. The idea that sacrifices must be made for the greater weave. There is a grammar to this change, an insistence that the whole is more valuable than the part. The parts that do not fit the whole are, by implication, expendable. Those who have been given power over others begin to use power with an economy that starts as efficiency and edges toward ruthlessness. There are practical examples. A system of rationing introduced ostensibly to manage supplies will grow ever stricter. Those found hoarding are shamed publicly. Others are relocated to more suitable climates. Re-education classes that start as literacy and civic engagement slowly morph into something else. Disciplined days filled with drills, the repetition of phrases until faces lose their private contours. Those who question are told, gently at first and then more sharply, that questioning fractures unity. The changes are not uniform. Different Primarchs practice their authority according to temperament. One will integrate a planet seamlessly by renovating its hospitals and courts. Another will withdraw a planet's civic apparatus and replace it with a military governor who manages water and light with a ledger and a lash. But the pattern is unmistakable. Human life is being shaped to conform to the needs of a larger narrative. Where once warmth and improvisation could guide a community through hardship, now plans are rolled out like maps that leave no room for detours. The improvisational tenderness of a farmer who knows the weather by the call of a bird becomes an incompetence in the calculus of logistics. As the Primarch's governance tightens, the warp grows louder at the edges. In the long transit lanes between worlds, piloting officers report static on comms that is too rhythmical to be random. A trader, used to hearing the occasional curdle of voices in the warp while their ship slips between stars, hears instead a phrase repeated like a pebble flicked across the face of a pool. It is a whisper that hints at the syllables of names. One almost recognizes, as if some memory is being intoned by something that can only approximate human speech. At first, crews blame equipment. They check filters, reroute power, recalibrate. The whisper returns anyway, more certain each time, as if the wound that produced it is being licked clean. Stranger still are the dreams. On a world healing under, a new flag. Children begin to speak of the same dream, a corridor that glows with a blue light, a door at the end that opens onto black, and beyond it a crowd of faceless things that holds out hands with palms like maps. A veteran awakens with a sudden hate of the color blue, the hue of his childhood dining hall. A mother wakes from a dream where her child is replaced by a small, exact replica made of wire and ribbon. The dreams slip like insects into the daily life of colonists, and as they proliferate, so do subtle behaviors. People start leaving tokens at thresholds, a string of beads, a scrap of cloth tied to a tree. The tokens are like fences against the subtle, palpable sense that something beyond the waking world is taking notes. The effect of those dreams on the Primarchs is not uniform either. For some, dreams are a curiosity, a thing to note and file. For others, especially those closer to the warp or to archaic rites, the dreams are a gnawing of something that might be a sign. A Primarch who once regarded the warp with protocol level, caution now cross-examines seers and augur priests, testing their interpretations like a craftsman testing steel. Those who would once have comforted now seem to listen with tighter faces. There is a hungry focus in their eyes that once belonged to scholars studying a problem rather than angels guarding children. The voices of the warp feed into policy. A small cult of orators who claim dreams as prophecy gains sudden favor because their visions seem to anticipate events that later occur. An officer's suggestion, whispered at the right ear, becomes a maneuver that saves a supply convoy from starvation, the sort of success that makes advice appear prescient. The combination of practical success and mystical resonance is intoxicating. When a strategy can be justified by both ledger and omen, it becomes hard to resist. The Emperor's design allows for adaptability, but what looks like adaptability can easily calcify into a preference for the unorthodox. That preference changes decision-making, a rumor stamped as insight becomes an order. At the level of the small and intimate, the changes are wrenching. Artisans who have sung their songs for generations find those songs banned because they imply individual glory. A child's game that names the wind freedom is outlawed because the word, authorities claim, complicates unity. People begin to notice the slow pruning of gestures that once characterized life. The warmth that used to pass through communities is being routed into channels, state festivals, national hymns, sanctioned remembrances, each one requiring registration and approval. The ritualization of affection becomes a subtle control. Love, when it must be declared in forms the state permits, loses the private curves that make it human. And always, there is the hum, the mechanical hush that has always been in the background, but is no longer merely background. Crawl spaces and maintenance ducts sing with new harmonics, as if systems not meant to talk to one another are now sharing confidences. In the caverns beneath newly built palaces, technicians find arrays of lenses tuned to unseen angles. In mines, equipment reads patterns in the ore that suggest not random formation, but deliberate design. The galaxy's surface, once a patchwork of improvised life, is being retooled along a single draft. The consequences are not contained. Where communities are reshaped, resistance sparks not always in overt rebellion, but in small acts of private defiance. A woman leaves an uncatalogued book on a bench in a square. A baker sneaks poppy seed buns smuggled into a ration packet for a child whose laughter she prefers not to see interfered with. A teacher writes the old lullaby into a child's notebook, with a marginal note that will be read later by a child who will, in secret, carry it to bed. These are minute insurgencies of tenderness, small, almost invisible, but persistent. Power responds in its own way. Policies adopt names with neat, comfortable rhythms. Transit harmonization, civic standardization. Enforcement is practiced with a gentleness meant to soothe. Officials arrive with pamphlets and with the suggestion of voluntariness. The best ones smile as they explain a new regulation that will save lives and increase efficiency. They are deputized by promises that seem humane, yet the processes they carry out are relentless. Consent shrinks under the weight of habit. until the habit is the only form of consent anyone remembers. Through all this, the warp continues to hum at the edges, like a vast and patient instrument being tuned. Its whispers braid into the soundscape until it is hard to tell where sound ends and idea begins. In the privacy of a Primarch's chamber, where once plans were drawn with a ruler and a confidence in their geometry, now an augury may sit on the table beside the ink and the maps. A Primarch might trace a line on a chart, pause, then fold the paper in half and write the same route in careful runes because a dream told him that the runes would be safer. Logic and superstition do not cancel each other out. They interlace into a new practice that is more dangerous precisely because it is comprehensive. The early horror build-up is not a sudden collapse, but the patient accretion of small forces. The Crusade achieves its goals, and the galaxy does knit closer together. Cities are rebuilt, and the dead are catalogued and given some payment of dignity. Yet the price paid is the subtle reshaping of people's habits, of the very ways they touch each other. Where once human life was an improvisational art, it becomes a composition scored and rehearsed. The music is played with more skill now, more guarantee of harmony, and precisely for that reason, it is the less alive for having been so bartered. In the last quiet pages of this chapter, listen again to the soft details. The creak of a hatch that hesitates before closing, the way a child's fingers trace the seam of a patched jacket as if memorizing the place where mother fixed it. The metallic aftertaste on a drink handed to a returning soldier who does not ask the origin of the glass, dreams thrum now as a chorus. The whisper of the warp is not yet a scream. It is an accent, a coloration that changes how people speak. The Primarchs are not yet monsters. They are, instead, people who have been given enormous tasks and who, under that pressure and the hunger of the warp, begin to convert tenderness into doctrine. And if you were listening carefully through this long, soft chapter, you will have noticed the way warmth and courage can fold into something stricter. The soundscape, once the comforting lull of engines and quiet songs, now contains another layer, the low, patient murmur that suggests a listener behind the listeners. It is not malevolent in the crude sense. It is older than cruelty, more like the patient interest of an ocean deciding where a current will go. For now it waits. For now, it takes notes. When you set the story down for a moment and breathe, keep that sensation in the hollow of your hand, the small, precise change of a world that is being reshaped not with triumphant drums, but with the slow, sure stroke of a pen. The Crusade continues to stitch and to heal, and because healing can be shaped into other things, the stitches sometimes hide an architecture that will one day not only bind, but bind itself closed. Close your eyes if you need to. Imagine the fleet still moving in that slow, obedient procession. Hear the thrums and the quiet chimes. Think of the hands that reach out and the hands that write the plans. The galaxy is being remade, and in the remaking, there is both salvation and the seed of an unease that will grow. Rest now, gently, because the next chapters will wake you to sounds less like lullabies and more like the long, insistent tapping of something knocking from the inside of a chest. The warm thread that had bound the Crusade together, the slow, patient promise of homecoming, the rhythm of repair and ceremony, thinned, then snapped. At first the change was almost polite, a campaign announced with solemn music, a measured speech that promised safety with new efficiency. Later, the music was no longer meant to soothe. It marched. The drums of the fleet's banners became a metronome to blood and decree, and under that steady beat, the world changed its tune. Imagine a city on a planet that had only recently tasted peace. Its streets had been washed, its plazas replanted with trees trimmed into tidy shapes. There had been laughter, uncertain and bright, as people learned to trade without fear. Then, like smoke that gathers without a visible fire, the first signs of fracture arrive. A market burned in a neat line, not by an accident, but by a pattern of incendiaries that trace the outlines of old neighborhoods and leave them to blacken like so many crossed-out names. Homes do not perish in the chaos of random war. They are chosen, selected as if someone had mapped which memories should die first. The image of burning cities becomes a new kind of lullaby, not for comfort, but for instruction. People learn, quickly and with little philosophical fuss, that there are reasons the flames choose. In bulletin boards and in the cold light of Vox links, lists are posted. Compliance forms, curfews, the locations of mandated assemblies. The voice that once read out reparations and teacher rosters now reads out quotas and punishments. A child who once watched a Primarch kneel to lift a toy now watches armored men remove the toy, catalogue it and file it under state property. The child's face hardens in the brief arc of learning that the world can take what it pleases in the name of order. War loses its mythical sweep and becomes domestic in its horror. The clangor of artillery and the glitter of noble banners are traded for quieter cruelties that stick like burrs to daily life. Ration lines under the noon sun that lengthen until toddlers sleep standing. The steady knock on doors at night that takes a neighbour and does not return them. The soft, exacting work of administrators who convert grief into paperwork. Compliance is not only secured by fear, it is folded into routine. The living come to equate silence with safety, and once that economy is set, the silence eats deeper. Space Marines, those mythic children in armour, begin to show the fault lines of their design. They were imagined as implacable, noble protectors, towers of honour who would stand between humanity and its extinction. But as the wars broaden and their campaigns deepen, the armour becomes a cage as much as a shield. Inside those chapels of ceramite, voices lower and the cadence of orders tightens into something that resembles prayer. The men who once took pleasure in the small human things, the taste of bread, the sound of a particular hymn, find those pleasures rearranged, catalogued into rituals that are no longer personal but exemplary. A brother's private joke becomes a teaching anecdote to be told to new recruits. A lullaby becomes an example of pre-crusade sentimentality, identity phrase. The gaps between man and armour do not only measure physical space, they measure narrative. A sergeant looks into a visor and sees the reflection of a company. A company looks into doctrine and sees the reflection of an empire. The self becomes an echo chamber where praise bounces and comes back shaped like obedience. Men awake in the long hours between watches and try to remember their names before the numerics and the honours and find instead a list of orders. In some barracks, old pictures are carefully burned because a face in a photograph might remind a recruit that someone once loved without permission. The Primarchs, each a map of virtue and vice, tilt increasingly toward their darker poles. Their flaws, the narrowness of Lionel Johnson's privacy, Fulgrim's taste for perfection, Perturabo's hunger for permanence, do not merely deepen, they ossify into doctrine. Where once a Primarch might have spared a town for sentimental reasons, now he will spare only what the campaign's ledger allows. A council convenes in a glassed hall above a city and transforms grief into coordinates on a map. Those coordinates are then built into a plan that is etched into the bones of a planet. Districts removed, names erased, waterways rerouted. The people who once sang in those spaces find themselves singing in permitted gardens that are placed precisely where the new maps allow them to be seen. The cruelty is often bureaucratic and thus more intimate. Officials learn to take what hurts most only a little at a time. They route the rituals of grief into state-approved forms with neat boxes to tick. They regulate mourning into schedules and assign slots for communal remembrance that can be observed without interruption. Those who deviate, who go to the river on a day not on the roster, who keep a private shrine in a cupboard, are not always punished with guns and flames. Sometimes they are punished by being rendered non-persons in official records, their births unregistered, their marriages nullified, their names left off manifest lists. It is a death by erasure, an absence folded into the ledger. The warp, that patient, intelligent ocean of feeling and possibility, rises like high tide. What had been an undertone becomes an insistence. The whispering that once grazed the transwires and manifestors begins to thicken into a choir. In the longer lanes of transit, where light years of quiet used to hold and slow down thought, men hear, more clearly than before, syllables that seem almost to be instructions. Pilots hear them in the rhythm of their engines. Children imagine them in the cough of their kettles. The warp, being not merely a place of storms, but a mirror of mind and soul, begins to leak content into the waking world. Dreams no longer stay in heads. They appear as graffiti on the walls of a city, as patterns cut into the ice of a mountain lake, as figures who stand in the peripheries of squares and vanish when approached. Those who had until now read the warp as a hazard, now begin to read it as a text with edges, and more dangerously, as a partner in governance. As the whispers grow, so do the rituals that try to answer them. Tech priests, those attendants of the machine god, once spoke their rites in a language of maintenance and liturgy, of coaxing reluctant hardware into service. But the language changes. Bolts are tightened and prayers are offered in the same breath. Sacred recitations are translated into code that runs on ancient consoles. The mesh that binds the logistic engines of a world is attuned to votive words. A machinist in a bay hums a benediction as he fits a valve, and the valve closes to an exact fraction of millimeter with a shudder that seems to be a sigh. The sound is precise and terrifying. The measured hiss of pneumatics that now answers faintly, with its own cadence of responded invocation. Flesh and machine begin to speak the same grammar. Implants grow more intrusive because they are not merely tools, but instruments of communion. A surgeon fits a neural relay beneath a child's scalp in a field clinic and hums the same litany the priest chirps in the chapel. Both are meant to bring the child into a shared field of attention. At first, the change is celebrated. Reaction time improves, disease retreats, workloads ease. But the side effect is a flattening of interior life. Where once a person might have a private grief held in a single chest, now their grief is visible as a pattern on a central panel, an entry in a communal ledger that someone else can glance at and weigh in upon. People find their sorrow now reinterpreted by diagnostics, their creative impulses scored as inefficiencies, their jokes passed for subversive content by the same sensors that track humidity. The tech priests, who have always walked a thin line between worship and engineering, tip into a different madness. Liturgy and firmware merge into an unholy catechism. In mechanized chapels, priests intone lists of part numbers like names of saints. They preach the holiness of redundancy and the heresy of entropy. Their voices are calm, their hands precise, but the cadence is no longer human. It is formal, strict and liturgical in a mechanical way that has the eerie quality of an incantation recited by gears. The prayers start to answer back, or rather, their answers are fed into the systems they maintain and return as directives. A valve obeys a hymn. A broadcast filter tightens because an algorithm interprets the hymn's waveform as security. The result is a new kind of faith that celebrates predictability over kindness and function over warmth. Those who once came to the tech abbeys for repair now find their bodies treated as hardware needing updates. A veteran with nightmares awakens and is offered, not comfort, but an adaptive chip to dampen REM cycles. He accepts. The nightmares for a time subside, but in their place a flatness arrives, a smoothed edge to dreams that leaves the veteran less tormented and also less himself. He can no longer recall the name of the woman he loved, because the pattern that once connected his memory to her has been optimized away as a source of inefficiency. As flesh and machine fuse, new aesthetics of horror appear. Limbs are replaced with limbs that flex too well, that slither with a precision no human muscle could match, and that whisper in a language of sprockets. Faces are scabbed with fiber optic filaments that glow in a half-remembered color. The tech priest's fingers, once calloused by holy service, are now smooth rods with tactile sensors. Their hymns buzz like a hangar full of relays. Worshippers attend to them with the same mixture of reverence and resignation as a congregation used to seeing miracles that make sense on spreadsheets. The psychological horror does not stop there. People begin to interpret their inner lives as metrics. Love is a frequency, grief is a waveform. Dreams are not merely private maps, but data points that the state can use to plan. A mother who dreams of her child being taken becomes, in the system's eyes, a liability, and thus is subtly nudged toward counseling, and, if her dreams persist, toward recalibration. The recalibration promises relief. It also promises subtle alteration. Personality traits that had once been idiosyncratic and beloved, a stubbornness, a particular cadence of laughter, are now flagged as variants, and suggestions are made to smooth those edges. The logic is efficient, and the logic is kind in its presentation, but it is an efficiency that begins to eat at the texture of people's private lives. Space Marines, too, are not immune to this logic. In their engines and armories, engineers fit them with more augmentation under the heading of improved survivability. A new servo here, a faster optic there. Their bodies respond with sometimes miraculous robustness. On the field of battle, they are unstoppable, but in the quiet hours, they find new echoes in their heads. The implants hum with a low frequency that answers, faintly, to a pattern in the warp. Where a Marine might once have had dreams of comrades and long nights of thinking, he now occasionally experiences an overlay of coordination, a sense that his actions are part of a larger choreography, whose other dancers are not all human. He hears commands that are not radioed and cannot be traced. The voice is not yet malicious. It is simply sure. That surety becomes a knife. When men are wired to trust outside their own fragile living judgments, the fissures widen into fractures. A captain, guided by a whisper translated by his implant into a tactical suggestion, orders a population center to be cleared because the warp pattern identifies it as an entropy node. The clearance is efficient. The captain's hands, which once trembled at the thought of children's laughter, now see only coordinates and outcomes. His sleep is not tormented, it is restful. The rest, however, is the rest of a man whose interiority has been smoothed by the idea that certainty is more valuable than empathy. As the instruments of the Crusade refine their tools, the architecture of coercion refines itself as well. Terrible new programs are piloted beneath the guise of benevolence. Psych optimizations offered to those whose productivity slips. Communal dream workshops that promise inclusion but subtly align imaginations towards sanctioned themes. Hygienic rituals that remove small freedoms in exchange for promises of health. Each initiative has its advocates and its technical champions. Each one is presented as a mercy for the greater good. The greater good, however, becomes less about flourishing and more about maintaining the pattern. Resistance arises in small human places. A choir in a reclaimed cathedral sings a hymn with a note that drones a half step off the chorus, insisting on human error. A child ties a ribbon to the leg of a chair and calls it a promise no one can digitize. A pair of lovers exchange a word that the filters cannot pass because the word is private and the filters are trained on a public vocabulary. These acts are not grand, they are scratches on the hull of certainty. But they are scratches that will sometimes later catch. Yet the machine of governance is patient. It learns to anticipate those scratches. It queries the patterns of whispers and the cadence of dreams. It builds predictive models not only of resource use, but of affection. In the backrooms of command, the Primarchs sit with historians and code augurs and make a curious calculus. They do not do this without moral debate. They do it with the iron logic of men who believe themselves to be shepherds. They test policies in dry runs and simulations and authorize actions that will reduce variance at the cost of coloring life. The crescendo of horror is not a single scream. It is a layering of tiny miseries that, when stacked, produce something like a new sky. The people under that sky learn to move slower, to sigh softer, to avoid the edges of streets at certain hours. They learn the taste of smoke that signals municipal cleansing rather than spontaneous conflagration. They learn how to shorten their stories to fit authorized narratives. They learn that love is a thing measured not solely by heart, but by registration. In the final nights of this swelling chapter, the sounds that had once cradled sleepers become measures of dread. The hum of engines is more insistent. The whispers of the warp are clearer. The prayers of the tech priests sound almost like a chorus of mourning bells tolled by machine. Flesh and metal keep finding one another in ways that bond and unmake. The Primarchs' obsessions for order, for beauty, for permanence, for purity are no longer private quirks but public policies. Their faces, once the comfort of myth, show lines that are not merely age but the map of decisions. In the mirror of their visors, they sometimes see themselves not as fathers but as architects, and in that recognition, a certain thinness has begun. Listen now, and you will hear the particular noises that mark this moment. The low roar of a cleansing engine as it sweeps a district clean, the faint chime of a loyalty algorithm confirming a community's compliance, the sudden clean snap of a child's game ended by an authority that says the yard is closed. Above these, like a sky that has turned to iron, the warp whispers more insistently, as if tasting what the world now offers. The warmth that began the Crusade still exists, like embers beneath ash. There are hands reaching to comfort one another, small defiant gifts hidden in pockets, songs sung softly in closed rooms. But the dominant tone has shifted from tender choir to metronome. The lullaby has been rewritten as a manual, and manuals are not poems. The horror that grows is not flamboyant. It is patient, domestic, and systematic. It teaches people to live in the same breath that it takes breath away. When you lay your head down after reading this, let the cadence of the words settle in your chest like a slow drum. Know that this is not the end, but the gathering that precedes a storm. In the dark between heartbeats, there are notes that want to be sung and not yet a chorus to sing them. The next movement will give that chorus a voice. Though whether that voice is salvation or doom is the question the night now holds. Keep your hand on the small comforts you can. The ribbon, the secret song, the unrecorded smile. They are small, but they are stubborn. And stubbornness is a kind of light that does not go out easily. When the engines of the Great Crusade sang their loudest, the music was no longer triumph. It was a summons. Whole swathes of space bore banners so dense they seemed to form a new sky. And under that manufactured firmament, the decisions that had been murmured in council rooms and chiseled into accords finally showed their teeth. The bright, slow warmth that had carried reunions and repairs was subsumed beneath an urgency of purpose that would brook no dissent. The crusade had reached its height, and height has a way of making the distance beneath it look like an abyss. At first, the change arrived as architecture. Entire systems were folded into new provinces with startling efficiency. Planets once stitched together by trade routes were remapped into grids and sectors, their old names rearranged into postal coordinates. Where a city had been a web of alleys and memories, now there were perimeters, checkpoints, and schedules that read like prayers. Curfew at dusk, lights down at the bell, identification cards visibly worn. A roster of tasks to be performed at sunrise. The language of governance hardened into law. Law crystallized into ritual. Ritual sank its teeth into habit. It was in that hardening that the Emperor's hand was finally shown plainly. He had always shadowed the story in myth, a distant warmth and a plan, a silhouette against first light. Now he moved like a geometer across continents of people, conferring with Primarchs at tables that were not so much round as they were instruments. He spoke with a voice that had the patience of ice, precise, measured, uninterested in the soft derivations of mercy. When a human life was assessed under his gaze, it became a datum to be allocated, an energy to be optimized, a node in a network. Where the child had once been cherished, now the child could be counted. The Emperor's love, revealed plainly at the summit of power, had the economy of a machine. Everything given had to be justified by productivity. Everything taken had to be accounted for in return on unity. There is a horror in being loved like that. Valued, yes, but as function, it is the coldest of mercies, to be made important only insofar as you serve a design. The Primarchs, who had been framed as saviors and shepherds, absorbed that lens and in many ways reflected it back. Greatness that had been the product of suffering and tenderness now turned on the world as a blade sharpened by necessity. Each of them, in their way, went from being the promise of a parent to the enforcement of a statute. Horus Lupercal, for whom the people once sang in spontaneous choruses, now wore a crown of constant expectation. Where his smile had gathered crowds, it now coerced them subtly. Honor had become a ledger he felt obliged to balance. He stood before cities and spoke of duty, until the words felt like commands from the heavens themselves. Not because he had spoken them with force, but because his presence made every heart involuntarily smaller. Men and women learned to measure their desires against Horus's shadow. The shadow was kind, administratively so, and kindness given with a stamp becomes something different. Obedience refined by gratitude. There is a slow, suffocating grief in the moment when gratitude yields to subjection. Sanguinius, whose touch had once been balm, began to carry martyrdom like a badge. His compassion deepened into an ethical requirement. Those who asked for solace now encountered sermons about the sanctity of sacrifice. To die for the crusade was canonized into choreography. In halls where he walked, parents lined up to offer their children for training programs, with a smile that was a small, brittle thing, because when an angel asks for a gift, the gift seems holy even when it is theft. Other Primarchs took different roads to the same precipice. Fulgrim's taste for beauty became an appetite that consumed the lives around him. What had once been coy artistry evolved into aesthetic purges where anything deemed unbeautiful in the service of the pattern was excised. Perturabo's love of fortification hardened into a doctrine of permanent siege. Entire regions were made into works of defensive permanence, their peoples lodged behind bulwarks that became prisons in the name of safety. Leman Russ, at first a thunderous hearth, became a brigadier of sanctioned ferocity. His hunts were turned into demonstrations of dominance, meant to remind other worlds of their place. Rogel Dawn's ramparts multiplied until cities were encircled and access was rationed. Each Primarch's virtue, stripped of its human counterweight and fed into policy, became a new form of compulsion. The horror of this conversion is not sudden in its mechanics. It's a slow inversion, tenderness recalibrated as technique, protectiveness institutionalized as control. The people who had once found solace in the gestures of these colossal figures now found those gestures measured and repurposed. Where a Primarch might once have cradled a child, the same act might be performed now to set an example, to demonstrate the cost of empire. The tableau would be photographed, the image archived, and then the child catalogued into a training roster. Empathy, when harnessed to propaganda, becomes a mechanism of erasure rather than remembrance. And yet the true change was not merely administrative. The warp, that ancient sea at the backbone of everything, had begun to speak in tones loud enough to be mistaken for command. Where once it had been a background weather, an undercurrent of dreams and omens, its whispers sharpened into motifs that crossed from private superstitions into public doctrine. What had been marginal, rituals at shrines, prophecies murmured at the edge of a crowd, now seeped through the machinery of state and returned as policy. The voice of the warp became a collaborator with the crusade, not simply an irritant. Tech priests, those ambiguous chanceliers of iron and prayer, found new directives humming through their relays. The machine god was invoked less as a metaphor and more as an operative partner. Firmware and liturgy braided together. A blessed phrase uttered at a control panel could trigger an automated quarantine. A denominational chant could feed a sensor array new parameters. The line between devotional act and systemic command blurred until it vanished. It is one thing to pray for aid. It is another to have prayer program the valve that controls life support. Bodies changed. The first surgeries had been necessary. Grafts to replace lost limbs, neural fay to stabilize trauma, replating to augment survivability in a universe that took and took. Those interventions began quietly to look less like care and more like calibration. Where once an implant was an answer to injury, it became an upgrade to loyalty. Neural links were sold with the argument of efficiency, the promise of steadier sleep and fewer nightmares. A mother consenting to an implant for her fear-ravaged son heard of the benefits in numbers. Reaction times improved by a margin, cognitive variance reduced by a fraction. The statistics were persuasive. The scars were small. The son slept without screaming. What the numbers could not capture was how the son measured himself against the grid that now read his dreams. A digital overlay in the brain streamlined his memory into tags and timestamps. When he tried to remember his father's voice, it came back as a file, fuzzy, compressed with metadata appended, date of recording, context, importance rating. The memory could be played back, but it lost the interior murmur of having once been private. It became a service. Some changes were grotesque in the old sense of the word. Transformations that offended the logic of the body, but did not, at first blush, disrupt utility. Limbs with extra joints allowed miners to work longer. Optical filaments embedded in cheeks gave soldiers new fields of peripheral vision. Respiratory canisters made it possible to live in atmospheres that once killed with a single breath. But the pace of augmentation accelerated, and soon the choice between human flesh and engineered function narrowed into an ultimatum: be retrofitted and remain useful, or be left behind. The definitions of personhood shifted as the line between organism and apparatus blurred. The Space Marines, once paragons of sacrificial protection, fell prey to this grinding arithmetic with especially brutal efficiency. They were designed to be adaptable, to give up the frailties of sleep and private grief to serve a wider theatre. So the addition of augmentation was easily rationalized. What was harder to justify was the psychological effect of having one's private interiority mirrored, analyzed, and optimized by the same systems that issued their orders. A brother, ironclad and unflinching in battle, could now be pinged by a remote diagnostic, prompting a mood realignment when his vitals indicated stress. The pain of a comrade's death, a memory that used to bloom into a private ritual of mourning, became a flagged anomaly to be patched. The patch worked in a way. The soldier returned to the line with steadier hands. He also returned with a less troublesome heart. Identity, that stubborn and messy thing, can be dissolved by tiny erasures. When the telltale marks of individuality are smoothed, accents adjusted, laughter normalized, habits flattened, people can function more predictably. They also lose the private scaffolding on which meaning is hung. The space marine who no longer dreams, for example, is efficient at war. He is also a blank space in which narratives can be written without contradiction. An army of blank spaces is easier to command, and then there was chaos, the whisper that slid in between the sedation and the design. For a time, the voices of the warp had been a background cadence, a weathered murmur like wind through reeds. But in the new architecture of the Crusade, whose arteries were now data, devotion, and discipline, the warp found ways to be more precise. It began to plant motifs and images that multiplied into policy. It did not scream or appear with horns. It offered intimations, suggestions, the aura of inevitability. Men and women began to hear, at the edge of a meeting, a phrase that resolved the debate. Code augurs would see a pattern and recommend a quarantine. Oracles would dream a number that matched a ledger. The coincidence was flattering. The human appetite for pattern made consent easy. Chaos's argument was not always clear in words. It worked by flattering needs. A leader who wanted certainty got a pattern in his dreams that justified a hard decision. A mother who wanted to keep her child safe was shown in a vision that surrendering them to training would make them strong. The whispers offered scale, making small sacrifices seem like a part of a grand arithmetic. It is a pernicious seduction, the presentation of terror as an extension of care. When an agent of change wraps itself in the robe of concern, resistance collapses into gratitude. As the Crusade sharpened, physical transformations took on religious overtones. The tech priests began to preach the sanctity of modification. They would chant in strange polyrhythms, their voices threaded with the tang of ozone and oil, and the congregation would answer with the sound of metal tapping metal. In clinics dressed as chapels, surgeons performed procedures with a priestly ritual. Blood was measured, recorded, and sanitized into metadata. Where earlier there had been hesitation and fear, now there was a liturgical assurance. The signature of the machine god appeared beside consent forms. To be altered was to be consecrated. To resist was to blaspheme against the safety of the whole. Body horror here was diffuse rather than pornographic. It came in incremental bureaucratic moves that gradually unmade the feeling of having skin as a private thing. Fingers became instruments, voices became channels. Faces, once repositories of joy and grief, became canvases for signaling devices. The new faces were efficient, and in many environments functional. They also carried a persistent strangeness. In the light of a market lantern, a mother might glance at a child with ocular filaments and feel a hitch of something like grief. A recognition that her child's gaze was now, in part, a display. Worse yet was mutation. Not that nightmarish flourish of tentacles and gibbering maw that lurks in children's tales, but the subtler mutations that bled identity into its functional parts. Dreams adapted to circuitry, the warp's imagery mapping onto implants so that what a man once saw in his sleep could now be read by an algorithm and used as data to predict his behavior. Thought patterns that once organized into narratives of love, sorrow, and confusion now looped into schemas. The psyche lost its opacity. Where interiority had once been a dim room, now there were glass walls and lights that allowed administrators to watch the furniture of the self. At the level of the state, the result was terrifyingly efficient. Whole campaigns could be calibrated to minimize variance. Those who refused to be measured were quickly rendered statistically negligible. They were not always punished with overt violence. Sometimes they were simply neglected. Medical supplies diverted, communication slowed, food rations deprioritized. Neglect on a scale is violence. It is also, under certain logics, a form of culling that seems sanitary, because it is slow and bureaucratic. The Primarchs responded in fits and starts. Some, like magnitude turned inward, sought to reassure themselves that what they had done had a reason. They convened councils of archivists, historians, and code seers who read the past like a ledger and the future as a spreadsheet. They argued in terms of lives saved, losses avoided, and efficiencies gained. Others took harsher measures. Konrad Kurz declared that fear could be weaponized into virtue and used terror as a discipline that taught obedience as thoroughly as any school. Angren's legions began to perform public displays of sanctioned rage, a ritualized violence that broke any spirit watching and turned mourning into spectacle. Lorgar's faith institutions became apparatuses of catechism, and with catechism came the architecture of conversion. There were, of course, uprisings, blunt instruments of fury that sought to tear down what had been erected. But those responses were met with a new severity. The Crusade, now honed by data and divination, crushed rebellion not merely with steel, but with predictive containment. Networks of surveillance took in chatter and snuffed contradictions before they could congeal into action. It is one thing to fight a siege when you know its position. It is another to have the maps of hearts and dreams and to preempt defiance by offering the precise dish that will satisfy hunger now and teach dependency later. Where the war had once been glorious, in the mythic sense, swords raised against darkness, it had evolved into a system that harvested the intimate. The state took lovers, songs, games, and prayers and turned them into consumables that could be rationed or redistributed. The aesthetic of terror was bureaucratic, and bureaucracy is the worst kind, unending, polite, and perfunctory. Citizens learned to format their speech into permissible molds. They learned to dream in ways the senses approved. The warp, adapting as always, met them there. Its whispers now co-opted, its imagery used to rationalize conformity. The psychological collapse that followed was both sudden and gradual. In certain months, the collapse happened like a seizure. Entire districts found themselves hollowed out overnight as the population was reallocated to labor distribution zones. Families were fragmented by policy. Households became operational units. In rooms once used for suppers, lists of available tasks were pinned to walls. Those who had once been architects of their own hearts now found themselves administering to the mandates of a grid. In private, men and women tried to hold on to small things. An embroidered handkerchief, a joke with an old cadence, the whispered name of someone they loved. Those small things were fragile, and the system was cunning. There were rumors, always rumors, of Primarchs who no longer recognized their own shadows, of sleepless nights when a leader would wake and find his hands shaking, and no longer certain which faces in his mind were his, and which had been placed there by council and code, of commanders who looked at legions and saw not children but columns of data, and of their brief, private mourning, where they realized they had made their sons into instruments and, in doing so, had hollowed those sons of the very thing they had vowed to protect. At the worst of it, some of the Primarchs did not merely preside over the system, they embodied it. There were rumors of private workshops, where flesh and sigillist circuitry were combined in experiments not authorized by warm light and public record. A whisper told of a hall where a Primarch sat with a sculptor and insisted that his face be altered to display certain sigils of command, thin bands beneath the eyes that pulsed slightly when he spoke, sending a faint bioluminescent suggestion into the crowd that softened nerves at his address. It reads like fable, but fable can be true, and truth has a way, in desperate times, of moving toward whatever will sustain it. The climax of all this was not a single battle, but a convergence. The machinery of empire, the whispers of the warp, the liturgical zeal of tech priests, and the exhausted compliance of the masses all clicked together like gears meshing under a heavy weight. At that moment, the sense that something fundamentally human had been traded away became impossible to deny. It was like a bell tolling in a cathedral that had been built to hold only numbers. The sound made the floorboards shudder. In the eye of that design, in a hall where maps were made and destinies assigned, the Emperor sat and considered the sum of the work. He did not speak with cruelty. He spoke with the firmness of a man tallying the last numbers in a ledger. Lives were inputs. Peace was the output. If some inputs had to be reformatted or removed entirely to achieve the desired output, it was a cost to be registered. No more melodrama than that. In his detachment there was a terrifying logic. To be loved by him was to be rendered legible. To be legible was to be owned. Night after long night, the chorus of the warp rose and fell like a tide against the hulls of the fleet. The people under its sound found themselves living in a world where their innermost dreams were no longer private, where their grief was counted and optimized, and where the saviors they had once bowed to now read them as resources. There is a final kind of terror in realizing that your life has been translated into someone else's plan, and that the translator, cold, precise human, had been faithful not out of malice, but out of devotion to the work. There are images I cannot uncall, and perhaps you should not want to keep them. You might imagine a child waking up to find that her doll's eyes have been replaced with filaments. You might picture a veteran who no longer knows how to weep because the sensor in his chest mutes the tears. Think of a Primarch who walks among the dead he has catalogued, and who feels a thud in his chest, the way a cartographer feels the wobble of his compass when the pole is shifted. Think of a city whose songs now have tempo stamps, whose laughter is discounted in municipal ledgers, whose prayers are routed through servers that decide which voices are relevant. And yet, even there, in the blackness of the apex, there glowed the smallest, most dangerous thing: stubbornness. Tiny acts of misregistration, an unlogged love letter, a lullaby sung off key, a child who hides a ribbon, remained in pockets and closets. They were small corruptions against the great pattern. They were also, to certain observers, the last of what it meant to be human. The warp listened to those acts with a complicated interest. Sometimes it mimicked them, sometimes it seized them, reshaped them, and returned them as formal rituals. The loop was now tight. The crescendo did not resolve into a single devastation. It resolved into an ossified new order that took its place like a thin frost. Under that frost, life continued, because life is stubborn, but it had been changed in tone and timbre. Men and women moved through their days like players on a stage whose script had been rewritten. The public face of the Crusade still gleamed with banners and proclamations of peace. Behind that face, the guts of a different creature churned, one that favored stability over tenderness, efficiency over error, and legibility over mystery. If this is the peak, if this is the moment at which the Great Crusade became something else entirely, listen for the sound that follows. It is not a scream, it is not fireworks. It is instead a thin, continuous note, like the sustained hum of a tuning fork that has been struck and then set into a room of mirrors. It vibrates in the teeth. It vibrates in the teeth of children who will one day sign their names to manifestos. It vibrates in the plates of ships and in the chests of those who cannot stop dreaming. In the midst of the clangor, the warp whispers drew closer, almost articulate now. They suggested names and strategies, images of futures where suffering was pruned out and everything fit its slot. They promised that the price had been paid, that the ledger balanced. Whether that promise was a gift or a deception depends on whether you value safety above song. If you prize the hymn more than the alignment, then the promise is a theft. So the Crusade stands at its zenith, a colossus with the face of a savior and the hands of an accountant. Its engines burn bright overhead. Its nets read minds. Its priests translate code into catechism. The Primarchs walk its halls and sometimes do not recognize their own reflections without the filter of policy. The Emperor sets his logic like a cold jewel on the brow of the future and looks up from his charts with a face that is not unkind, but is unyielding. In that hall, as the maps are rolled and the final annotations written, a strange hush takes hold. Not the warm hush of the beginning, but a brittle one. An anticipation like the silence before a bell is struck. The warp leans in. The people wait in a way that is not wholly restful. Something moves in the shadow of the triumph, a presence that is not fully seen and therefore is not fully understood. When the bell finally rings, it may sound like the end or like the next beginning. Either way, its note will change the shape of any life that hears it. For now, in this high-cracked moment, the Crusade holds its breath and the world, adjusted and analyzed, turns its face to the light the victors have made, and in the white glare you can almost see the outlines of a different story forming, one where the cost of unity has been written in the margins of human hearts. The work of making a universe orderly is never tidy. It leaves margins, loose threads, pockets where the light does not reach. Those pockets have names now: sectors and wards, provinces and sanctuaries, the quiet numbers on a ledger where a life once had a face. The Crusade, in its luminous arrogance, believed itself a great remedy for a small and scattered species. In the end, it cured many ills: famine, ignorance, isolation. But it also grafted a new tendon onto the body of humanity, and the tendon tightened like a cord that will not slacken. There is no tidy ending to tell. The trumpets that once heralded reunions have become tonal markers in a new liturgy. The banners fold and unfold with mechanical precision, and beneath them the people walk as if along a long, rehearsed promenade. Some keep hope like a coin in a pocket, practical, small, useful for buying a moment of delight. Others keep hope like a prayer, whispered and private. A few bind it into rebellion, a loose knot of songs, a buried scrap of paper, a preserved lullaby sung off the record. These acts are not grand. They are thin threads of warmth in a world whose main warmth is now a heat belt measured in kilowatts. The Primarchs move on. They are not merely generals. They are lodestars and warnings, figures whose myths will be told in both halls and alleys. Each wears the mark of what was asked of him and what he allowed himself to become. Some bears are visible, scars, implants, sigils branded into bone that glow faintly when a speaker calls their names. Others are subtler, a tightened jaw, a softened glance that seems to be mourning a memory he cannot quite remember owning. Their magnificence endures, as does their capacity for harm. They are pillars of the new order and, at the same time, its architects, those who had once been children of the galaxy, infants of fate who grew into infernos of will, follow into paths that, externally, are carved of purpose. Internally, the lines are less clean. Fulgrim's mirror, once an instrument of beauty, sometimes reflects a face carved by decision, not time. Perturabo's bastions stand like great teeth around the places he claimed to defend. Behind their walls, some lie safer but feel smaller, their horizons boxed into grids. Russ's hunts become rituals that teach obedience through spectacle. Rogel Dawn's fortifications become the frameworks of a society that measures civic virtue by how precisely one follows the guard's bell. The contradictions are everywhere. Kindness harnessed into control, protection woven into captivity. The machine that runs this order hums ceaselessly. The tech priests have not fallen silent. They speak in newer tongues now, ones the common ear cannot pass without an interpreter. Their chapels glow with diagnostic readouts, their altars display schematics, and their prayers are layered into firmware. The worship of the machine god has become the governance of bodies. Clinics and reconstructions happen with gentle scheduling and exemplary rhetoric. There are cues, there are forms, there are consent boxes signed with the flourishes of gratitude. The language of ritual and the language of paperwork have become one. To bless is also to authorize an update. And the Warp Watchers, it has always watched. A patient organism of suggestion that feeds on thought and dreams, and the small electricity of longing. Now it sits closer, like a guest who has been invited to dinner and allowed to sit at the head of the table. Its whispers are not always ruinous in tone. Sometimes they are only a cool hand promising steadiness. But promises can be traps when they answer the particular hungers of those who already want certainties. The warp has learned to offer patterns so neatly formed that mortal minds mistake them for revelation. There are places where the warp has become a religion of results. Oracles and seers rise and fall in influence as the pattern favors them. Metrics and visions align. The ledger concurs with prophecy. In those places, the line between precautionary measure and ordained destiny blurs until it is impossible to tell if an edict is born of calculation or dream. When a mind hears advice in the patterning of its sleep and sees that advice borne out in the next day's movements, the advice acquires authority that is not easily argued against. The unions of omen and ordinance make resistance more complex than human defiance. To oppose the pattern is to oppose the apparent shape of fate itself. And so the horror of it is not only in what is broken or taken, it is in what is smoothed away. It is the erasure of the ragged edges that make a life recognizable as a life. It is the loss of missteps that once taught empathy, the shrinking of private space where a joke could live without being archived, the declawing of sorrow and its repackaging as a defect. People become legible, efficient, predictable, and in becoming so, they become easier to arrange, inventory, and if necessary, discard. Bodies continue to change. Augmentations have become ornaments of status for those who can afford the highest calibrations and instruments of survival for those who must take them. Some adaptations grant wondrous faculties. A miner with limb joints that allow work at impossible angles. A child whose visual implants let him read light patterns as if they were opened books. But these gifts come with their debts. Neural filters that smooth nightmares also smooth nuance. Facial filaments that signal status can be tuned to inspire trust or obedience. In the privacy of many rooms, people test the edges of themselves and discover that what they are given to help them sometimes asks of them an exchange they were not fully told was required. What is perhaps most grievous is the quiet of spirit that can follow such exchanges. When inner life is standardized and external function rewarded for its faithfulness, the muscle of imagination atrophies. The small private pains that once made people reach out, a neighbor's groan in the night, a child's sudden silence, become data points and thereby cease to be immediate calls to tenderness. The bureaucratic gaze sees them as maintenance tasks. Help comes in scheduled visits rather than in spontaneous arms. Love, when it must be booked into a calendar, becomes a commodity. The commodification of feeling does more than alter systems. It alters the substance of being. Resistance persists because no system is complete and no human heart fully compliant. Gardens in back alleys, songs sung beneath breath, letters folded and hidden in the secret places of furniture. These are the acts of non-conformity. They are small and sometimes futile, but they are stubborn. They are the last sparks that refuse to be catalogued. They are, for some, proof that the species is not wholly subsumable by policy. The warp, curious and jealous, sometimes rearranges these sparks into new patterns, sometimes in mimicry, sometimes as mockery. The loop tightens, but it never fully encloses. There are nights when even the Primarchs dream. Their dreams are not always the grand epics of championdom familiar to song. Sometimes they are thin, domestic images, a mother's hands trimming bread, a boy hiding in a pantry, the sound of rain on a metal awning. These images are like small fractures of memory that refuse to be polished away. They root themselves under armor and return like weeds. On those nights, in the dim hours before council, some Primarchs touch the scarred hollows at their throats and feel the faint illogic of tenderness. The contact is brief, policy pulls harder than pity. Yet the briefness is telling. It is a measure of what remains, small and vulnerable, beneath the iron we have asked for. In the private halls where maps are folded and numbers cross-checked, conversations occur that are neither triumphal nor despairing but clinical. Men and women who have mapped the universe measure out the cost of what has been done and decide what further streamlining will be necessary. They speak about stability, about survival, about entropy. They speak as if the future is an equation that can be balanced. They forget, sometimes by design and sometimes by exhaustion, that equations are not the same as stories. Narratives breathe while numbers hold still. What is certain is this: the structure that has been built is resilient. It will endure because it is efficient at making things endure. It will endure because many of the ills it tried to fix are real and dire. It will endure because the people who run it believe in it with a fervor shaped by a desire to save. But its endurance is not innocence. It holds within it the capacity to demand more and more conformity in the name of a continued peace. It will ask for sacrifices that are small and cumulative. It will ask, politely and persistently, that the human be ever a little less human in service of the whole. And there are things that watch from the apparatus itself, not always malicious, not always overt, but present. The warp leans like a tutor over the shoulder of a child and suggests solutions. The tech priests tune their instruments like monks and keep the great engines in a state of chittering prayer. The Primarchs walk with measured strides, their faces lit by maps, their hands folded on dossiers. Each of them is a creature of purpose and of compromise, moving toward destinies that are less a line and more a spiral. Return, repeat, refine. This is not an ending that offers light. It offers instead a kind of comprehension that the age of reunification has become the foundation of something else. The dreams that once promised home now template behavior. The songs that once soothed are now used to certify loyalty. The hands that once cradled children also sign forms that list them as resources. The calculation is cold. The motives are, at times, tender. That is the terror. The impossible mixture of care and control, of love and ledger. So the story closes as it began, with stars and with hush. But the hush is different now. It is not the lullaby of a galaxy gently rocking itself. It is the attentive silence of watchers who have learned to wait. They wait not with hunger alone, but with an interest precise enough to chart the smallest flicker. They catalogue every strain of resistance and every whisper of dissent, not to snuff it out immediately, but to fold it into a plan. Plans are patient. Plans win, and the Primarchs march, not always toward glory, often toward a destiny that is darker and more complex. The maintenance of a machine of souls, the guardianship of a pattern that will not be unmade. They stride down avenues paved with the bones of choices they made and did not regard as choices at the time. They move like titans, and yet their steps are bound by the ledger. In their chests, there is still whatever small thing made them human once, and that small thing trembles occasionally, like a moth against a glass. The tremor is tiny. It is also terrifying. Listen then, for the last small detail. In the nights when the air lies flat and the city lights are striped like the bars of a cage, you can hear the distant, soft sound of machinery humming in a pattern almost like a lullaby. It is an engineered lullaby now, tuned to reduce panic, to encourage sleep, to make the morning docile and the day productive. It is comforting when you are exhausted and terrible when you are not. It is the sound of a world taught to rest by design. They are not gone. They are not asleep. They are still here, moving, watching, making plans that will take generations to finish. They watch because that is their purpose. They wait because the universe is patient. In the end, what remains is not protest nor capitulation, but the knowledge that the thing we hoped would save us has, in some measure, remade us. It has given safety and taken other things in return. Whether the bargain was worth it will be debated until the stars grow cold and new ones burn in their place. But until that distant hour, be mindful of the small acts that survive. Keep the songs, hide the ribbons, teach the off-key hymns to a child. These things may be small, but smallness has a stubbornness of its own. In the quiet, the watchers count, and in the dark they wait. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they are waiting.